we've officially reached the end of the summer movie season. So now it's time to rank every summer 2022 release that I saw, from the worst to the best. Coming in at last place at number 18 is Sneakerella. Now, I've said before, I'm not against people doing remakes or retellings as long as you can make it different and fresh enough to justify its existence, and this movie tries to do that, but fails. It has some good songs, and they kind of reminded me of In the Heights, and I like the two actors who play the stepbrothers, but other than that, it's not worth watching at all. It feels like a Disney Channel movie that, for whatever reason, they decided to dump onto Disney Plus instead, and it's pretty boring. There are a ton of much better Cinderella movies out there. You're much better off watching one of those. Number 17, Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, which I know is going to be a highly controversial opinion, because my opinion on this movie and Turning Red have gotten me the most hate this year. The reason I didn't like this movie isn't because I was expecting a ton of cameos and it didn't deliver on the hype. No, I figured going into it wasn't going to have a ton of cameos because it's not an Avengers movie. The reason I didn't like it is because I was expecting a fun comic book movie. What I got was an occultishly dark, graphically violent movie that I am shocked was not rated R. I go into Marvel movies expecting to have a fun time, but I ended up leaving with a very dark feeling, and this is coming from somebody who enjoys Harry Potter. And I think what also hurt it was it changed directors pretty far into production. Scott Derrickson, who directed the first Doctor Strange, was supposed to also direct this one, but he left over creative differences and the job went to Sam Raimi, and as a result, it's a movie that seems a bit bogged down by its own ambition. The end of the first Doctor Strange movie sets up Mordo to be the villain, but they completely forget about it, and also, when Derrickson was directing, they announced that the villain of this movie was supposed to be Nightmare, but that's not a plotline in this movie. So you can tell it was changed very drastically, very late into production, which I think hurts the film tremendously. Number 16, Hollywood's Stargirl. Now, I did not like the original Stargirl movie. I thought it was boring, and frankly, nothing happened, and it focused more on the supporting characters than it did her, but this was a huge improvement over the first one. There's actually conflict in this movie, and Stargirl actually feels like the main character, and it feels like she actually changes throughout the story. While it's not particularly impressive, it was at least a step up from the original. Number 15, Lightyear. A movie that feels like they made it without using a complete script, but rather used an outline of a script. Right away, the film expects us to buy into the idea that this was Andy's favorite movie when he was a kid. But if we're supposed to buy in that idea, this movie means that it would have come out in the 90s or earlier, but it doesn't feel like a movie that came out in the 90s or earlier. It feels like a movie that came out this year. And any interesting ideas this movie has are very underdeveloped. Its pacing is all over the place, the first half moves too quickly, and none of the main characters are that interesting. Honestly, other than the robot cat, I can't remember a single character from this movie or anything about them. It was a very forgettable Pixar flick. Number 14, Secret Headquarters. If it were the late 2000s or early 2010s and I were a kid, I probably would have loved this movie. But I'm an adult in the decade of the 2020s, so for me, there wasn't that much. This feels like a movie that should have come out during that time period because it has all the cliches of a 2000s kids movie. Everything about it is pretty generic and safe. It's not awful, it's pretty watchable, but there's really not much for adults. But for kids movies, it's pretty harmless. Number 13, The Invitation. A pretty decent little horror movie with a creepy atmosphere, though it does kind of lose itself a bit in the third act. It has all the horror cliches you expect, but it is still pretty fun. It has a good mystery to it, it has some good twists, it has some pretty good actors. For what it was, I enjoyed it. Number 12, Jurassic World Dominion, which is frustrating to put so low on this list, because I love the Jurassic Park movies, well, most of them, but unfortunately, this film was very unfocused. It had a bunch of different plot lines, so much so that it didn't even have time to focus on the biggest selling point from the last film, mainly the idea of, can man and dinosaur coexist? And by the time this film ends, that question isn't even resolved, and we're basically back to square one. It's fun seeing the old and new characters interact. The first 20 minutes or so where we're exploring different locations and how they're dealing with the dinosaur problem is fun, but it's a mess of a film with too many ideas. Number 11, Where the Crawdads Sing. A pretty well-crafted movie about relationships that turns into a compelling murder mystery. It has great performances, and I found the film engaging, but it is somewhat held back by the ending as it's left fairly ambiguous, and so as a result it feels kind of unsatisfying, but I still thought this was an interesting movie. Number 10, Paws of Fury, The Legend of Hank. While the story and message have both been done to death, a lot of the jokes in this movie were actually pretty smart. The animation is also mildly impressive. It has a good cast. It even has a bit of a self-aware edge to it where it kind of knows it's cliche. And while it doesn't really break any new ground, I was still entertained and I was surprised by how funny it was. Number 9, Thor, Love and Thunder. A movie that accomplished in 2 hours what couldn't be done in 2 movies. I actually cared about Thor and Jane's relationship. They gave Jane a satisfying character arc, and Christian Bale gives a great performance as the villain, stealing every scene he's in. Some of the jokes felt overused, and certain lines of dialogue felt extremely out of character for the characters that said them, but I was still satisfied with the movie. Number 8, DC's League of Super Pets. This is another movie that I probably would have loved if I were a kid, but as an adult, I found kind of average. It had some good voice acting and some nice little references for DC fans, but it's really no different than a lot of the other talking animal movies out there. Number 7, Samaritan. A movie that's pretty good and has some interesting ideas, but it doesn't quite live up to its full potential. It isn't this big spectacle of a comic book movie with people flying around or shooting lasers. It's very street level and smaller scale, which is a bit refreshing, but as far as elements like the villain go, they could have been fleshed out more. Number 6, Top Gun Maverick. I know a lot of you are probably mad, disappointed, or confused that this isn't number 1. Now let me be clear, I enjoyed this movie, but what pushes it back a little bit is the first half. Because the first half was so reminiscent of the first film that it was a bit distracting. But after that, it becomes pretty exciting. The dogfights were engaging, I thought Miles Teller was perfectly cast as Ghost's son, and I enjoyed his dynamic with Tom Cruise. It's a well-directed, exciting film that just relies a bit too much on the legacy of the original. Number 5, Elvis. I thought this was a fascinating biopic that also serves as a deeper cautionary tale about the dangers of show business. I'll be very surprised if Austin Butler isn't nominated for an Oscar for this movie. Likewise, I'll be surprised if Tom Hanks isn't nominated for a Razzie for this movie, because his accent is just odd. But I still thought this movie was absolutely fantastic. Number 4, the Bob's Burgers movie. A fun mystery movie with sharp writing, great characters, and catchy songs. Even if you haven't seen the show, it establishes everything you need to know in the first 10 minutes. The characters are all well written, each having a personal problem or goal that you want to see them gain by the end, and it had a genuine heartwarming sweetness to it. Number 3, Minions: The Rise of Gru. Now, if you're not a huge Despicable Me fan, this isn't going to change your mind. It doesn't reinvent the wheel with the franchise. But if you're somebody who enjoys these movies, you're going to get exactly what you expect. Slapstick humor and other cartoony hijinks. It's also got some nice little throwback references to the other films. I thought the villains in the movie were all very creative and fun. I was highly entertained. Number 2, Luck. A film that has a lot of creativity with ideas of good and bad luck, and it has an interesting world to spend time in. It also has a great message and is heartwarming. It was produced by John Lasseter, who left Pixar, and that's a shame, because Pixar has not exactly been on their A-game as of late, with the exception of Soul. This feels like the kind of film that Pixar used to make, and should still be making. It does have a few pacing issues towards the end, but I still thought it was a creative movie. And coming out at number 1 is Chippendale Rescue Rangers. This is the funniest movie I've seen this year. It has all the sharp satire of stuff like the Lego Movie, smart commentary on the creative bankruptcy of Hollywood, washed-up actors, animation, and in some ways it kind of feels like an unofficial sequel to Roger Rabbit. There are also a ton of cameos and Easter eggs, some of which I was not expecting in this movie. This movie's got something for everyone to enjoy. Kids will love it, adults will love it. It's hilarious, it's smart, and it comes in at number 1 as the best movie of summer 2022. So go ahead and share your ranking of the summer movies that you saw, and I will see you next time.